So now we're going to discuss the first vulnerability we're going to exploit, and that's the Microsoft 08-067 vulnerability. This was also known as the NATAPI vulnerability. Now, everyone tends to use this in ethical hacking as the first hack, and the reason why is it's a fairly easy hack. It works really well, and it works pretty much every single time. So we're going to go through this one first and get our feet wet. Where does this attack fall in? Well, we're going to gain access using this attack, and this attack actually gets us a system level user. So we're actually going to have an escalation of privilege at the same time. So we're going to be in both phase 3 and phase 4 simultaneously as we begin this attack. So MS08-067, what does that really mean? Well, MS08-067 is the vulnerability number that Microsoft assigned to this particular bug in their code. It is the Microsoft Server Service Relative Path Stack Corruption. Now, this vulnerability allows for a remote exploitation of a Windows 2000, 2003, or XP system. Now, once we got into Windows 7 and above, they had started fixing this vulnerability and taking it out. Sometimes you'll find that it works on Windows 7, sometimes it doesn't. It depends if the person is actually patched for it. But it works almost all the time in Windows 2000, XP, or 2003 if they're using file sharing services on one of those machines. So what are the requirements for Microsoft 08-067 to work? Well, you have to have a vulnerable service. In this case, the server service is on port 445. That's why I said you have to have file sharing enabled for this to work. When we set up our lab before for our Windows XP vulnerable box, we went and we enabled printer and file sharing. That is so that this vulnerability will work and we can attack it. This requires that the Windows firewall is either disabled or file and print sharing is enabled. And what we did was we left the firewall on, but we opened up the port for file and print sharing. Is the machine still vulnerable? Well, Microsoft released a patch back in October 2008. Microsoft Windows XP Service Pack 3 was released in May of 2008, so this was before the patch was released. So if you have a brand new Windows Service Pack 3 system like the one we made, it's still vulnerable. And again, even though there's a patch available, not everyone puts those patches out. The hotfix knowledge base article is KB958644. If you want to learn more about this vulnerability, you can go in there and read all about it, that Microsoft is giving you the technical details. Because they've given us those technical details, the attackers have been able to reverse engineer it, and now we have this exploit available. In Metasploit, in the Metasploit framework, we have to have an exploit to be able to go against that particular vulnerability. And the nice thing is, with Metasploit, they tend to keep the same naming scheme as Microsoft to make it easy for us to find. So we talked about the fact that Microsoft called it the MS08-067 vulnerability, while Metasploit calls it the MS08-067 NATAPI exploit. So when we search for that, we'll be able to find it there. So what this module is going to do is it's actually going to exploit a parsing flaw in the canonicalization code path of the NATAPI 32 DLL through the server service. If the process reaches a state where the next instruction to execute is in the stack, the exception is raised. If it's not handled properly, then the process is going to be terminated. So the developers of the exploit have actually taken the vulnerability, reverse engineered it, so we now have an exploit that works. And when the flaw is introduced, instead of terminating, it's going to actually go and run the payload that we desire, which in our case is going to be a reverse shell. So whenever you're setting up Metasploit, you have to set up two main things, and that's your exploit and your payload. It's how are you going to break into that vulnerability, and what are you going to do once you broke in. So in our case, you'll see here that we search for the exploit MS08-067_NATAPI. We use that exploit. We then are going to set a payload, which is what we're going to do once the exploit is thrown. And in our case, we're going to use the Windows Meterpreter reverse TCP. And then I showed you the options. And from here, you'll see that we need to set a remote host. That's going to be who we're going to attack. We need to set a local host. That's ourself, our Kali IP, so we know who that remote host is going to call back to. And you'll see here our exploit and our payload are shown here on the screen. So if I run this exploit, what are the forensic examiners going to be able to see? Well, here I pulled up the log files, the application, system, and security log files. Notice that before the attack, the numbers have not changed from before to after. Again, that's because we're using the Meterpreter reverse shell, and Meterpreter runs exclusively from memory. It doesn't actually even get logged in the system. So it's not in the applications, it's not in the system, and it's not in the security. So as you can see, there's very little trace of our efforts here. Now, once we broke in, depending on what we do, that can change the number of records because we might trip on things that launch applications, that we actually hit the security trip points, or that we actually affect the system. But just running the exploit itself has no effect on our log files, making it a very quiet exploit for us to use. And so now that we've walked through this, and you see that we are going to be able to gain our access and our escalation of privileges, we're going to walk through it interactively as I go through the attack in the lab environment.